Audiobook Academy Biography presents Joseph Stalin. It was during Joseph Stalin's control of the Soviet Union that Russia was modernized and the Nazis were defeated. After the death of Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin took over as General Secretary of the Russian Communist Party and ascended to the position of Soviet dictator. There were millions who died from famine or were deported to labor camps because Stalin demanded quick industrialization and collectivization of agricultural land. During World War II, his Red Army was instrumental in the defeat of the Nazis. Early years. Iosif Vissarionovich Jugashvili, afterwards known as Joseph Stalin, was born in Gori, Georgia, on December 18, 1879. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin was born to Vissarion Jugashvili, a cobbler, and Keta Vangeladze, a washerwoman. He had smallpox at the age of 7, which left him with a disfigured visage. His left arm was significantly disfigured in an accident that occurred several years later. Other accounts claim that he had blood poisoning as a result of the injury. He was bullied by the other children in the village, which made him feel like an outsider. As a result, Stalin embarked on a quest for glory and renown. Stalin for those who crossed him, he developed a cruel streak. Soviet First Lady Svetlana Stalin aspired to be an Orthodox priest like her son. Gori's church school accepted him in 1888, thanks to his mother's efforts. As a student at Tiflis Theological Seminary in 1894, Stalin was awarded a scholarship based on his academic achievement. A year later, Stalin made contact with Messaim Dasi, a secret Russian pro-Georgian organization. Socialism was brought to his attention by some of the group's socialist members. Stalin became a member of the organization in 1898. Stalin quit seminary school in 1899, even though he was an excellent student. Official school records showed that he dropped out because he couldn't afford to pay the tuition, while other accounts claim he did so for other reasons. According to some accounts, Nicholas II's Tsarist authority had requested him to leave because of his anti-Tsarist political ideas. Stalin decided to stay in Tiflis and devote his time to the revolutionary struggle instead of returning to Russia. The Tiflis Observatory employed him at first as a tutor and afterwards as a clerk. He joined the Social Democratic Labour Party in 1901 and began working full-time for the uprising. Russian Revolution. First of many arrests and exiles during the early years of the Russian Revolution, he was detained for orchestrating a strike in 1902. His new Russian name was Stalin, which means steel in the language. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin excelled at the more mundane aspects of the revolution despite not being a strong orator like Vladimir Lenin or an intellectual like Leon Trotsky. Outlawed by the Tsar's secret police after his escape from exile, he continued his robberies, kidnappings and extortion in the shadows. Stalin became notorious for his role in the 1907 Tiflis bank heist, which claimed the lives of numerous people and resulted in the loss of 250,000 rubles, about $3.4 million at the current exchange rate. The Russian Revolution got underway in February 1917. A home arrest order had been issued by March, following the abdication of the Tsar. A provisional administration was initially supported by the revolutionaries in the hope of a seamless transfer of power. Bolshevik leader Lenin, on the other hand, attacked the temporary government in April 1917, stating that the people should rise up and take control by seizing land from the rich and factories from capitalists' hands. The Bolsheviks had taken power of Russia by the end of October, when the revolution had been completed. Communist Party. After the revolution, the Soviet Union's young government was torn apart by factions fighting for power and control. In 1922, Stalin was named General Secretary of the Communist Party, a newly constituted position. Even though it was a relatively insignificant position at the time, Stalin was able to consolidate his power by having final say over all party member appointments. His nominations were clever, and he solidified his influence so that practically all members of the Central Command were under his control. It was too late when anyone recognized what had happened. No matter how seriously ill Lenin might have been, Stalin was too strong for him. Great Purge. Stalin rose to power in the wake of Lenin's death in 1924, pledging to overthrow the existing party hierarchy and seize complete power. He began by removing persons from positions of authority through shuffles in the bureaucracy and denunciations. Leon Trotsky, an anticipated successor to Vladimir Lenin, was among those deported to Europe and the Americas. Further paranoia crept in and Stalin quickly carried out an extensive reign of terror, arresting people at night and staging magnificent show trials. Potential rivals were accused of siding with capitalist countries, found guilty as enemies of the people, and murdered without trial. The Great Purge eventually included local officials suspected of anti-revolutionary activity as well as members of the party's upper echelons. Famine and reform. Reversing abolitionist Bolshevik agrarian policy, Stalin seized land and organized collective farms in the late 1920s and early 1930s. In essence, this returned the peasants to their former status as serfs, which they had previously held under the monarchy. Stalin hoped that socialism would increase food production, but the peasants despised being forced to work for the state and give up their land. During the subsequent famine, millions of people were either slain or starved to death as a result of forced labor. As a result of Stalin's accelerated industrialization, millions of lives were lost and the environment was severely harmed. Millions of people were deported to the Gulag or executed for their protests, which were met with fast and terrible retaliation. Second World War. Stalin made an apparently clever move in 1939 when he signed a non-aggression pact with Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party. In Stalin's eyes, Hitler was a man of his word, and he disregarded military advisors who warned him that Germany was preparing an offensive on its eastern front. The Soviet army was utterly unprepared for the Nazi blitzkrieg when it struck in June 1941, and it instantly suffered tremendous losses. Stalin was so shaken by Hitler's betrayal that he spent many days hiding in his office. All of Ukraine and Belarus had been seized by German forces by Stalin's time, and German artillery had surrounded the city of Leningrad. To make matters worse, the Soviet army and government leadership had been decimated to the point of near disintegration because of the purges of the 1930s. In 1943, the Germans were defeated at the Battle of Stalingrad thanks to the courageous efforts of the Soviet army and the Russian people. Early in 1943, even before the Allies had launched a serious threat to Hitler on D-Day, the Soviet army was freeing countries in Eastern Europe. The West and Stalin. As soon as the Soviet Union entered the war, Stalin insisted that the Allies open a second front against Germany. This was because Stalin had always been skeptical of the West. Churchill and Roosevelt contended that such an action would result in a large number of casualties for both countries. Stalin's distrust of the West grew as a result of this, as millions of Russians were killed. Roosevelt and Churchill met with Stalin to discuss post-war arrangements as the war began to swing in the Allies' favor. At the first of these talks, which took place in Tehran, Iran, in late 1943, Stalin was in a strong negotiating position following the recent victory at Stalingrad. In the spring of 1944, the Allies agreed to launch a second front against Germany in response to his request. A second meeting of the three leaders took place at the Crimean resort town of Yalta in February 1945. Once Eastern European countries had been liberated by Soviet forces, Stalin was in a better position to discuss the restructuring of their governments. As soon as Germany was defeated, he also volunteered to join the fight against Japan. In July 1945, during the Potsdam Conference, things began to change. After Roosevelt's death in April of that year, Harry S. Truman was sworn in as the new president. Clement Attlee had replaced Winston Churchill as Britain's main negotiator following the British parliamentary elections. Because they were concerned about Stalin's intentions, the British in the United States were wary of his plans for post-war Japan. In August 1945, 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Japan, forcing the country to surrender before the Soviets had a chance to organize relations with other nations. When he was convinced that the Allies were against the Soviet Union, Stalin became preoccupied with the possibility of Western invasion. A huge buffer zone was created between Western Europe and Mother Russia as he installed communist governments in numerous Eastern European countries between 1945 and 1948. As a result of the West's interpretation that Stalin intended to subjugate Europe, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, was established to fight Soviet dominance. To achieve full control of Berlin in 1948, Stalin put an economic blockade on the city. It was only when the Allies replied with the enormous Berlin airlift that Stalin finally backed down. As a result of Stalin's encouragement of North Korean Communist leader Kim Il-sung to attack South Korea, he suffered another foreign policy setback. He had already instructed the Soviet ambassador to the UN to boycott the Security Council for refusing to admit the newly created Communist People's Republic of China to the UN. The Soviet Union was unable to deploy its veto when the Security Council voted on a resolution to assist South Korea. How many people were killed by Joseph Stalin? Around 20 million people were reportedly slaughtered under Stalin, whether in the form of mass starvation or executions carried out in concentration camps or other forms of forced labor. According to some experts, Stalin's mass murders qualify as genocide and make him one of the most merciless mass killers in history. Death. Stalin's health began to worsen in the early 1950s, despite his popularity after World War II's victories. He ordered the chief of the secret police to start a new purging of the Communist Party when an assassination plot was discovered. On March 5, 1953, Stalin died, preventing the plan from being carried out. In spite of his achievements, he left behind a legacy of murder and terror. In 1956, Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, publicly attacked Stalin's policies. Many young Russians, though, are rediscovering his appeal. Thank you for listening in Audiobook Academy. Don't forget to subscribe and smash that like button for more content like this. See you in next video.